The Great War was supposed to be the end of history. In 1918, when the guns fell silent across the Western Front, an entire generation of Americans, British and French, believed that the price paid in the trenches was so high that no leader would ever dare summon the specter of total war again. The world wanted to dance, to build, and to forget. In the United States, the Roaring Twenties saw a nation turning inward, intoxicated by jazz and prosperity, convinced that the Atlantic Ocean was a permanent moat against the madness of the Old World. But beneath the surface of this newfound peace, a cancer was growing. The peace treaties signed in the gilded halls of Paris were not bridges to the future, they were weights tied around the neck of a defeated Germany. For a decade, the world ignored the warning signs, mistaking the quiet for stability. We begin our story in the ruins of a broken empire, where a single, overlooked man began to weave a narrative of victimhood that would eventually set the globe ablaze. The birth of the Second World War didn't happen on a battlefield, it happened in the minds of a humiliated people. Following the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to accept Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. This wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was a psychological branding that told every German citizen they were solely responsible for the deaths of 20 million people. The resulting economic reparations were so staggering that the German mark became more valuable as wallpaper than as currency. In the back-alley beer halls of Munich, a frustrated veteran named Adolf Hitler found his calling. He wasn't a military genius yet, he was a master of the big lie. He told the German people they hadn't been defeated on the battlefield, but had been stabbed in the back by politicians, communists, and Jewish citizens. To a proud nation eating out of garbage cans, this message of redirected blame was more intoxicating than the beer he stood over. The Great Depression of 1929 was the final nail in the coffin of German democracy. As American loans vanished and banks collapsed, the moderate government crumbled. Hitler didn't seize power in a violent coup, he was invited in. By 1933, he was chancellor, and the ghost of Versailles finally had a physical form. He immediately began dismantling the very laws that put him in power, turning a republic into a cult of personality. For the American observer at the time, this seemed like a distant European melodrama. We were busy with our own breadlines and dust bowls. We saw the grainy newsreels of torchlight parades in Berlin and thought of them as a strange, foreign fever that would surely break. We failed to realize that Hitler was building a society entirely optimized for a single purpose, the reversal of 1918. By the mid-1930s, the German factories were humming again, but they weren't making tractors, they were forging the steel for a new kind of army. The youth were being indoctrinated in camps, taught that their life's highest calling was to die for the state. The ghost had stopped mourning its past and started planning its revenge. The world watched as Hitler tore up the Treaty of Versailles page by page. He stopped paying reparations, he rebuilt the Air Force in secret, and he grew the army far beyond the 100,000-man limit. Each time he broke a rule, the League of Nations issued a sternly worded letter. Each time, Hitler learned that the policemen of the world had no interest in walking the beat. Hitler's greatest weapon in the late 1930s wasn't his tanks, it was his understanding of the trauma of his enemies. He knew that the leaders of Britain and France would do almost anything to avoid the carnage of the Somme or Verdun. He began a series of territorial shakedowns that were essentially high-stakes games of poker where he held a weak hand but a terrifyingly confident face. In 1936, he sent a small force into the Rhineland, a region that was supposed to stay demilitarized to protect France. His orders to his generals were explicit. If the French move, retreat immediately. Germany wasn't ready for a real war yet. But the French didn't move. They waited for the British, and the British waited for a consensus that never came. Hitler won his first major bluff, and his popularity at home soared to godlike status. 2 years later came the Anschluss, the union with Austria. Nazi agents stirred up internal chaos until the Austrian government buckled. Hitler rolled across the border in an open-top car, greeted by cheering crowds and flower-throwing supporters. It looked like a peaceful unification to the outside world, but beneath the surface, it was a hostile takeover. The map of Europe was being redrawn without a single shot being fired. Then came the Sudetenland, a mountainous border region of Czechoslovakia. Hitler claimed the German speakers there were being persecuted. It was a fabricated crisis, but it brought the world to the brink of war in 1938. This led to the infamous Munich Conference. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of Britain flew to meet Hitler, believing he could tame the dictator with reason and diplomacy. At Munich, the Western powers committed a betrayal that still haunts history. They gave Hitler the Sudetenland without even inviting the Czechs to the meeting. Chamberlain returned to London famously waving a piece of paper and declaring, "Peace for our time." In the United States, newspapers praised Chamberlain for his wisdom. We wanted to believe the paper was a shield, but to Hitler, it was just a scrap of trash. The tragedy of the bluff was that it convinced Hitler that the West was decadent and weak. He came to believe that no matter what he took, the umbrella-carrying politicians would never fight back. This overconfidence was the engine that would eventually drive him to invade Poland, a move that he truly believed would be met with more meetings and more scraps of paper. By 1939, the geopolitical chessboard was set. But there was one massive, unpredictable piece: the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler hated each other with a visceral ideological loathing. Fascism and communism were supposed to be oil and water. The world assumed that if Hitler pushed east, he would eventually slam into the red steamroller of the Russian army, and the two monsters would destroy each other. But Hitler was a pragmatist before he was a fanatic. He knew that Germany's greatest failure in WW2 was fighting a two-front war, trapped between France in the west and Russia in the east. He needed to neutralize Stalin before he could strike. In a move that stunned the global intelligence community, the two rivals signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939. To the public, it was a non-aggression treaty. The headlines in New York and London were filled with disbelief. How could the man who built his career on crushing Bolshevism shake hands with the butcher of Moscow? The answer lay in a secret protocol attached to the document. The two dictators had taken a map of Eastern Europe and literally drawn a line through the middle of Poland. This was the Devil's Pact. Hitler gave Stalin permission to take the Baltic states and half of Poland in exchange for Soviet grain, oil, and, most importantly, silence. For Stalin, it was a way to buy time to rebuild his own purged military. For Hitler, it was the final green light. The moat of Russia had been turned into a bridge for German expansion. The pact was the ultimate betrayal of the international order. It signaled that the era of diplomacy was over and the era of the strong man had arrived. In Washington, President Roosevelt was horrified. He realized that the two most powerful totalitarian regimes on Earth had just formed a temporary alliance of convenience. The greatest generation of Americans was still finishing high school, unaware that this signature 4,000 miles away had just sealed their fate. The countdown had begun. With his eastern flank secure, Hitler ordered his generals to finalize Case White, the invasion of Poland. He no longer feared a British blockade or a French counterattack because he had the resources of the Soviet Union at his back. The world held its breath, hoping for one last miracle, but the devil had already shook hands on the deal. At the break of dawn on September 1, 1939, the silence of the Polish border was shattered by a sound the world had never heard before. It wasn't just the boom of artillery, it was the high-pitched whine of the J-87 Stuka dive bomber. This was the debut of Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. It was a terrifying symphony of tanks, motorized infantry, and air power moving in perfect radio-controlled harmony. The Polish army was not the primitive force of legend. They were brave and had modern equipment, but they were fighting a 20th-century war against a 21st-century concept. The German panzers didn't stop to fight line by line. They simply drove around the Polish defenses, cutting off communication and leaving the frontline soldiers confused and isolated. The lightning bypassed the strong points and struck directly at the heart of the country's infrastructure. For the American public watching this on newsreels weeks later, the speed of the conquest was incomprehensible. We were used to WW2, where gaining 100 yards of mud took 6 months and 50,000 lives. In Poland, the Germans were capturing entire cities in days. The sheer mechanical efficiency of the German Wehrmacht sent a shiver through the American military establishment, which at the time was ranked lower than the Army of Portugal. As the Germans pushed from the west, the second half of the Devil's Pact was triggered. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. The Polish people, caught between the two most ruthless war machines in history, had no chance. It was a double-cross invasion that saw the two occupiers meeting in the middle to shake hands and hold a joint victory parade in the ruins of a sovereign nation. The brutality of Case White was a preview of the war of extermination to come. This wasn't just a military occupation, it was the beginning of the Holocaust and the systematic destruction of Polish culture. The SS units followed the tanks, carrying lists of intellectuals, priests, and leaders to be executed. The new order had arrived, and it was written in blood. By the end of the month, Poland had vanished from the map. The lightning had struck, and while the world was still rubbing its eyes, the victim was already gone. The success of Case White validated Hitler's most dangerous instincts. He now believed his army was invincible, and his destiny was manifest. When the news of the invasion hit London, the peace for our time bubble finally burst. Neville Chamberlain, the man who had tried so hard to be the world's grandfather, was forced to become its herald of doom. On September 3, 1939, he sat in 10 Downing Street and spoke to the nation via radio. His voice was cracked with the weight of failure as he delivered the ultimatum. Germany must withdraw, or a state of war would exist. Hitler didn't even bother to reply. He was in his command train, heading toward the front, convinced the British were still bluffing. But the British Empire was a massive, slow-moving beast that once roused was impossible to stop. Across the globe, from the docks of Sydney to the plains of Canada, the call went out. The British Commonwealth was going to war. France followed suit, though with significantly less enthusiasm. They mobilized their millions of men and sat behind the Maginot Line, a massive series of underground forts waiting for the Germans to come to them. This led to the Blitzkrieg, or the Phony War, a strange period of several months where the Western Front was eerily quiet while the world waited for the next explosion. In the United States, the reaction was a complex mix of sympathy and Fortress America mentality. President Roosevelt gave a fireside chat, saying, "This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in mind." He knew that the American people were not ready for boots on the ground, but he began the quiet work of preparing the factories. The ultimatum changed the nature of the conflict from a regional land grab into a global struggle for survival. It was no longer just about Poland, it was about whether the rule of law or the rule of the sword would govern the 20th century. The British and French fleets began a blockade of Germany, and the first U-boats began hunting merchant ships in the Atlantic. The tragedy of the ultimatum was that it came too late to save Poland, but just in time to ensure that the war would end until one side was completely destroyed. The lines were drawn, the sides were chosen, and the long fuse that had been burning since 1919 had finally reached the powder keg. In the autumn of 1939, the United States was a country trying to sleep through a thunderstorm. We were a nation of 130 million people, many of whom were the sons and daughters of those who had fought in World War I. The prevailing sentiment was never again. The Neutrality Acts were strict laws designed to keep us from being dragged into another European slaughter by merchants of death, arms manufacturers. But the great silence of American isolationism was being chipped away at by the sheer scale of the Nazi threat. In the White House, FDR was playing a delicate game. He had to respect the isolationist America First movement led by heroes like Charles Lindbergh, while simultaneously finding ways to help the British. He knew that if Britain fell, the U.S. would be standing alone against a Nazi-dominated Europe and an expansionist Japan. American industry was the sleeping giant. While we only had a few hundred tanks and an army that practiced with wooden rifles because of budget cuts, our factories were the best in the world. Slowly, the cash and carry policy was enacted, allowing the Allies to buy American goods as long as they paid in gold and carried them on their own ships. The arsenal of democracy was beginning to stir, but it was still in its pajamas. The winter of 1939-1940 was a period of tense waiting. Americans followed the winter war between Finland and the Soviets with intense interest, rooting for the underdog Finns. It was a moment of moral clarity for many Americans, realizing that the new order in Europe was one of pure aggression. The silence was becoming harder to maintain as the moral weight of the conflict grew. Then came the spring of 1940, and the great silence was shattered forever. The German lightning turned west, swallowing Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands in weeks. When the impenetrable French army collapsed in just 6 weeks, the American public felt a jolt of pure electricity. The moat of the Atlantic suddenly felt very narrow. By the time the smoke cleared from the beaches of Dunkirk, the debate in America had shifted. It was no longer, should we stay out, but how much time do we have? The story of how the war began ends here, at the moment when the United States realized that the world was on fire, and the smoke was already drifting across our shores. The prologue was over. The struggle for the soul of the world had begun. As the sun set on 1939, the world that had existed since the Victorian era was gone forever. The maps were being redrawn in charcoal and ash. What started as a corporal's grudge in a Munich basement had evolved into a global conflagration that would eventually claim 60 million lives. The war to end all wars had failed its mission, and the human race was now locked in a fight to determine if the future would be defined by the light of liberty or the darkness of a 1,000-year Reich. For us, looking back, these 6 chapters are more than just dates and names. They are a reminder of how quickly a civilization can slide into madness when it chooses comfort over courage and appeasement over action. The story of how WW2 began is a cautionary tale that the fires of war are easy to start but nearly impossible to extinguish until everything is burned to the ground. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the greatest drama in human history was just beginning its first act. Would you like me to create a detailed narrative about the American home front's transition into the arsenal of democracy?